This is section 6, lecture 1. In this section, we're going to be talking about Congress's powers in U.S. foreign policy. This overlaps with chapter 5 of your textbook. And as you look at this material and as you study this material, you should really think about it in the context, and I will explain it in the context of countering the president's power in foreign policy, because of course the Constitution has these two co-equal branches share power in foreign policy. So let's look at the language of the Constitution itself. All legislative powers are vested in the Congress. One of the key powers that we're going to be discussing regarding Congress's influence in foreign policy is the laws that it can make, the amendments that it can tack onto laws regarding foreign policy. This is one of the key ways that Congress gains influence. The House of Representatives shall choose their speaker and other officers and have the power of impeachment. This doesn't necessarily speak to foreign policy, but it does speak to influence. The House chooses its own leadership, thus its own priorities, its own policy goals. And perhaps we could say the power of impeachment is one of the is a general check over the office of the presidency, and could be threatened in this case of foreign policy differences. If we look beyond this, other explanations for impeachment are there below in section 3. The other key area that we're going to be looking at of Congress's influence in foreign policy is their budgetary power. This is called the power of appropriations, or the power of the purse. And we see here from the Constitution, all bills for raising revenue originate in the House of Representatives. Below that, the Congress has the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Well, that applies to foreign policy, particularly if we're talking about duties, tariffs, so on and so forth. To pay the debts of the United States, that is an international or foreign policy issue. To provide for the common defense of the United States, that is a foreign policy issue as well, dealing with national security. To borrow money from other nation states, to regulate commerce with other nation states, to establish uniform rules for naturalization. Immigration policy is part of foreign policy as well. Here we have a list of several more powers of the Congress regarding their lawmaking policies, but also their influence in foreign policy as well. To punish piracy committed on the high seas. That's technically foreign policy because it happens outside of the United States. One of the ones that we're going to be talking about that is very key is to declare war. The president is the commander-in-chief and has that supreme control of the military, but it is in Congress's power to declare war and also to pay for wars. To raise and support the armies, well, that has to do with their budgetary powers. To provide the Navy, to make rules for government and regulations of the land and naval forces. This is lawmaking power over the military. Also to provide calling forth a militia, arming the militia, so on and so forth. And then I have this line from the Constitution underlined down there at the very bottom. The Congress has the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying out the execution of foregoing powers. That is a catch-all for the lawmaking power of Congress, not just domestic laws, but perhaps those that touch upon foreign policy as well. And so we see in the Constitution, in the language of the Constitution, the intention of the founders. This is the terminology that we used in the previous lectures, co-determination. That the Constitution is established to separate and share the powers over foreign policy between the President and the Congress. So let's look at these in a general sense. One of the key ones that we're going to be talking about in the next lecture is the power of appropriations. This is Congress's budgetary powers. There, in the language of the Constitution we just saw, it's the Congress's duty to raise revenue, to lay taxes and collect them. And this is referred to as the power of the purse. Those who control the money have an inordinate amount of power because they do control the money. So the President must go to Congress for all funds regarding foreign policy. Presidential policies oftentimes can be stalled out because of this, because Congress doesn't necessarily want to pay for them. And we will see in the next lecture any number of ways where Congress is given great levels of influence in foreign policy just on this budgetary or appropriations power. One of the things that we mentioned in the earlier lectures, and that is a power of the Congress that's mentioned in Article 2 of the Constitution, is the ratification of treaties requires 2/3 of Senate approval. Well, we discussed in the earlier lectures, the presidential section, that executive agreements have tended to replace formal treaties. And so once this was a very powerful tool or area of influence for the Congress in foreign policy. But now, because of the increased exercise of executive agreements by the last several presidents at least, this power of Congress, formally in the Constitution, is somewhat limited. The power to regulate trade and regulate commerce is a law-making power that is influential for Congress. This is where they have a lot of say regarding who we do business with in the world, how we do business with them. This includes trade treaties such as NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. It also includes placing embargoes on nation states. We'll talk about that in a subsequent lecture. Tariffs, taxes on incoming goods, so on and so forth. We will mention these issues primarily in our economic statecraft chapter later on in the course. But one thing is worth saying here, that we see the two key making, sort of key policy making or key power making areas, the budgetary power and the law making power in these formal powers. A formal power, just because Congress meets, debates, and deliberates, is that they're able to express their opinions on foreign policy. And they do so to criticize the administrations, to criticize presidents, to get their own foreign policy issues across, and to try to sway public opinion in setting the foreign policy agenda that may reflect their own ideals. This is something that your textbook discusses within a particular context. Historically, there has been this idea that Congress's influence on foreign policy stops at the water's edge. And this means that the debates, the deliberations that go on regarding our foreign policy should only go on within a domestic context, and that Congress's influence, their perhaps disagreements with administrations, should only be within that domestic context, stopping at the water's edge, that is, within the confines of our own geographic space, and that Congress should not try to exercise influence abroad on its own. That is the power of the executive branch, the State Department, the Defense Department, the administration. Well, we see that throughout history this doesn't tend to be the case, even though that's a saying that Congress's influence or say should stop at the water's edge. We do see congressmen and senators traveling the world on so-called fact-finding trips. We have recently seen Congress invite foreign dignitaries to speak in front of Congress, really without the approval of the administration. And so then that old saying that Congress's influence should stop at the water's edge has kind of fallen by the wayside. Another formal power of the Congress is its oversight of the executive branch. This is part of our checks and balances system that we have, emanating from the sharing of powers in the Constitution. And so this oversight power oftentimes leads to investigations in foreign policy areas. Typically, we really only see these in foreign policy mishaps, what are perceived failures. And so the examples that I have there, the Iran-Contra controversy, the Benghazi controversy, the surge in Iraq, the Senate report on pre-war intelligence, that's about the failures of our intelligence community and the administration to not understand that there were not weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Typically, these investigations are reactionary, and oftentimes only reactionary to sort of the negative outcomes of foreign policy. But that's not the only way that Congress exercises its oversight. Oftentimes, Congress is briefed on foreign policy, on national security issues, and give their opinions then. But the formal investigations usually are only in reaction to negative occurrences. Another key constitutional power of Congress is the declaration of war. And this is something that we're going to be discussing, particularly regarding your discussion question for this section. The War Powers Act is one that we'll be talking about in Lecture 3 of this section. This is a formal power of the Congress that has also sort of fallen by the wayside, like 2/3 Senate approval for treaties. The declaration of war is rarely used, and it's less important than it has been in the past. And so I have here that there was no declaration of war for the U.S. involvement in Korea or in Vietnam or in Grenada or Panama. Or Iraq, both Iraq wars, or Afghanistan. What the Congress and administrations rely on now are not formal declarations of war, but are referred to as authorizations for the use of military force. And we'll explain what that means and why there might be key differences when we talk about the War Powers Act in Lecture 3. As I mentioned earlier, the other real key influence of congressional power in U.S. foreign policy is lawmaking. And so we're going to have a separate lecture regarding the lawmaking power of Congress. I mentioned earlier that this involves the regulation of trade and commerce, but it also involves any number of things, particularly conditioning laws, adding amendments, conditioning spending. These powers of Congress they exercise frequently in order to sway policies in general, but particularly in this case foreign policy, in order to get their way, in order to set the agenda, in order to show their disagreements with particular administrations. We mentioned impeachment. Technically, we could say that in the true and penultimate failure of a foreign policy, that Congress may move to impeach a president. This hasn't happened specifically regarding foreign policy, but if we look at political science in general, there are two key areas where leaders are overthrown and removed. One is an economic crisis, and then the other is in a failure of war, of course, which would be related to foreign policy. And then finally, another formal power of the Congress is to call for constitutional amendments, but of course this is very rare.